Welcome, everyone, to the Humanizing Palestine lecture series for 2025 and 2026. Today, we have the distinct honor and pleasure of hosting the authors of the book, the groundbreaking book, From Apartheid to Democracy, a Blueprint for Peace in Israel-Palestine, written by Sarah Lee Whitson and Michael Omer-Man. Before I introduce our esteemed guests, I want to encourage everyone to visit the website of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers Law School, which is the host of the Humanizing Palestine lecture series. The website is csrr.rutgers.edu. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights is the only and the first academic civil rights center at an American law school that focuses on the human and civil rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asian communities in the United States, as well as abroad, especially insofar as events abroad impact those communities here in the United States, and how U.S. foreign policy in Muslim-majority countries or in countries with very large Muslim minorities, how those foreign policies impact the civil rights of these communities here in the United States. You can follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR on Instagram and Threads, or on Facebook and in Twitter at RUCSRR, and also on LinkedIn. I also encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we record all of our lectures, and you will have over 110 videos to choose from in learning about the broad array of topics that fall under the mission of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And also, if you are a podcast listener, I encourage you to subscribe to the Race and Rights podcast, which I have the privilege of hosting. My name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and also the executive director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And finally, I encourage you to consider making a donation to CSRR if you find our lectures helpful, if you find the resources on the website helpful, and if you believe that the mission of CSRR is essential today when we are witnessing normalized and mainstreamed anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian bias and anti-Arab bias in the United States and even globally. So just go to csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. Now, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to invite and to host two brilliant practitioners, a very seasoned, internationally known international law lawyer, an expert, and an internationally known journalist and expert on politics and society in the Middle East. Let me first start by introducing Sarah Lee Whitson, who is the executive director of DAWN, Democracy in the Arab World Now, an organization that advances democracy, human rights, and accountability in the Middle East. From 2004 to 2020, Sarah Lee Whitson led the Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division, overseeing work in 19 countries. She has conducted numerous advocacy and investigative missions on conflict, accountability, and reform, and her writing has appeared in major outlets, including the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and the Washington Post. Ms. Whitson is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on the boards of several rights and justice organizations, including the International Center of Justice for Palestinians, ALQST, and the Armenian Bar Association. And her forthcoming book, which we'll be discussing, her published book, which we'll be discussing today, From Apartheid to Democracy, a Blueprint for Peace in Israel-Palestine, offers a vision for conflict resolution in Palestine, Israel. Her co-author, who we are also equally honored to be hosting, Michael Schaeffer Omer-Man, is the director of Israel-Palestine at DAWN. He is an expert on politics and society in the region with a focus on Israel's policies of occupation and annexation, its civil and human rights record, and the influence of the U.S.-Israel relationship over those areas. Prior to joining DAWN, Michael worked as a journalist in Israel-Palestine for more than 10 years. He served as the editor-in-chief of 972 magazine for 7 years, and before that worked as an editor at the Jerusalem Post. In these roles, Mr. Omer-Man closely covered Israeli and Palestinian grassroots movements and civil society campaigns, legislative trends, public opinion, as well as diplomatic and other efforts to strengthen accountability for Israeli abuses and the rule of law. He's been regularly interviewed on these topics, and his analysis and reporting have been quoted by the BBC, Al Jazeera, Haaretz, The Daily Beast, NPR, and many others. So we are very honored and privileged to be hosting, again, the two authors of this remarkable book. And before I cede the floor to them, I just want to remind everyone how important it is that we have these conversations about Palestine, about Israel, at a time when there is a genocide happening in Gaza against Palestinians by the state of Israel. And the fact that we can have these conversations in the United States has been something that many people have wanted to stop, and in pursuance of violating academic freedom and free speech. And so at CSRR, we're proud, and we will continue to defend the right to think critically, to talk about controversial issues and issues of matters of public importance, and that we will encourage everyone to listen and hear perspectives they may not necessarily agree with, and make their own decisions and conduct their own analysis. And that requires open intellectual inquiry, which I'm very much looking forward to doing today. So with that, Sarah Lee Whitson, Michael Omer-Man, welcome. And Sarah, I will cede the floor to you to begin this important conversation.
Thank you, Sahad, for this invitation. I should note that Sahad is a board member of Dawn and has just been tremendous support in the operation of our organization and all of the work that we do. And I also want to take a moment to commend the work of the Center for really featuring such amazing speakers. Least of all us, frankly. It's, I think, really got the finger on the pulse of the most important civil rights issues in our time. So thank you for that work at Rutgers, and thank you for having us. You know, Saha, you talked about the importance of delving into new topics and coming at things with an open mind. We are going to tax the audience here today to really ask you to come with an open mind, because the ideas that we're presenting today require a great deal of imagination, require a suspension of disbelief, disbelief that it's hard to imagine a peace in Israel-Palestine. It's hard to imagine a future in which the people of Israel and Palestine can live securely, safely, under democracy, equality, and human rights. And the past 2 years of genocide in Gaza have made that even harder to imagine still. But yet, we in this book are trying to offer a vision of hope, a practical vision, a radical vision, but one we think actually offers the best plan for getting us out of this man-made catastrophe, this man-made morass of suffering and apartheid. So I want to invite you to all suspend your disbelief and imagine what a different future can look like, and believe that it is in fact possible, because again, the problems we face are entirely man-made. We do have a PowerPoint, and I'll ask Mike to share that while I speak, so I think that might end up blocking me out. But we are, we are in a moment that is really ripe for new ideas, ideas about what we can actually do. For a long time, for really decades, the international community had fallen into a sleepy daze, choosing to pretend that the question of Palestine could be ignored, that the territory was quiet, that the Palestinian people and their aspirations for justice, their aspirations for equality, their aspirations for democracy could really just be erased. And the international community was only too content to live with the permanent Israeli occupation of the Palestinian people, and the US government to pursue Israel's normalization with Arab dictatorships as an occupying apartheid state. Just something that we had to accept. But the attacks of Hamas on October 7 and the genocide that has emerged in Gaza since then has really jolted the international community out of its slumber. We are, of course, tremendously grateful that there is a ceasefire of sorts in place for Gaza. But a ceasefire is not an end to the conflict. In fact, putting aside the daily breaches of the ceasefire by Israel, it is a temporary placeholder for something that needs to change. And I think that what's still missing is a credible, actionable plan for what comes next. What the Trump administration has put forward as a temporary stopgap for Gaza under foreign rulership, as a piecemeal plan for Gaza and Gaza alone, is not a plan to end the unlawful occupation and apartheid of Palestine. Um, now, I'm sorry, I'm trying to flip the pages, but I don't know if Mike is doing that. So, we are at a juncture where the International Court of Justice has concluded an agreement with international law scholars around the world, an agreement with Dawn, our own organization, that Israel's occupation is illegal and must end, that Israel's occupation is characterized by apartheid rule and must end, that these are crimes for which the International Court of Justice, subsequently followed by the United Nations General Assembly, has ordered Israel to end its occupation, withdraw its settlers from occupied territory, and end its apartheid rule over Palestinians. The deadline imposed by the UN General Assembly for that expired in September, sadly, with no progress on Israel's part. So we have put forward a new plan because we start with the understanding that the Oslo process and the two-state plan that it put forward has failed. Numerous commentators, numerous writers have long recognized the death of the so-called two-state solution under the Oslo process. In fact, a recent book by Rob Malley and Hussein Agha, who are both negotiators for the Clinton-led peace plan for Israel-Palestine that followed the framework of Oslo, is dead. The problem is that there is no plan to replace it. And that's what we've tried to put forward to help escort the international community out of its comfortable and convenient slumber, out of its easy commitment to the dead Oslo process two-state solution. The plan that we put forward is radical in two critical respects. And you will find that these two underpinnings of the blueprint that we put forward are really undergirded with sort of two principal approaches. Two principal approaches that break with the past failed approach to Israel and Palestine. And I'll explain those both. Number one, the blueprint that we put forward has a fundamental priority to do two things: to end Israeli occupation and apartheid, to end the crimes of Israeli occupation and apartheid ahead of issues of statehood and governance. So the prior Oslo process approach made the ending of Israeli crimes of occupation and apartheid conditional on an agreement on governance, conditional on an agreement about borders, an agreement on refugees. However, we believe, and we believe that international law and basic understanding of criminal law is on our side, that we must prioritize first ending Israeli crimes ahead of addressing questions of governance, that we cannot justly and equitably address questions of the future governance of Israel-Palestine until we first dismantle the crimes of occupation and apartheid. So that is the central aim and mission of the blueprint, to dismantle occupation and apartheid so that we can then address questions of governance. The second way in which the plan that we put forward is radical in breaking with failed past approaches, and therefore we hope successful by refusing to repeat the failures of the past, is that we believe that those questions of governance, whether Israel-Palestine should become two states, whether it should be one state, whether it should be a confederation, whether it should be binational, that is a decision that only the people living between the river and the sea must make, and it is a decision that they must make democratically. So past failed approaches have allowed the international community to appoint or to treat as representative of Palestinians, in this case the Palestinian Authority, the unelected, illegitimate leaders of the Palestinians, de facto leaders who have not been elected for over a decade and have no mandate, to represent all Palestinians. And it treats the criminal Israeli government, whose prime minister has been indicted by the International Criminal Court and elected in an apartheid government, as the sole representative to speak on behalf of the Israeli people. So we reject that approach, and we allow the people between the river of the sea to have a democratic election at the culmination of the end of our blueprint, at the end of the plan, to democratically make that choice. We also refuse to treat Palestinians and Israelis as two monolithic blocks that can be represented by a single representative group, and flattens the individual identities of millions of Israelis and Palestinians into a mono feature of their national identity. We believe that Israelis and Palestinians are diverse, that they, as individual human beings, share diverse opinions, that they are not reducible only to their national identity, but may have opinions and views that sometimes align, for example, liberal secular Palestinians with liberal secular Israeli Jews, and religious Palestinians with religious Israelis. And you will find overlap on their opinions on a variety of issues that cut well across those flat mono national identities. So we prioritize the individual voice of the individual human beings living between the river and the sea, and we give them all a chance to participate in the ultimate decision about how governance should take place. The way in which the blueprint proposes to accomplish these two things, and here is where we really seek your leap in imagination, is with the establishment of a 3-year transitional government in Israel-Palestine. And Mike is going to go into the details to describe just what exactly that 3-year transitional government does. But this transitional government, in a nutshell, is designed to create the conditions for the democratic decision making that will take place at the conclusion of the transitional government, based on 3 fundamental principles: principles of equality, equality for all Palestinians and Israeli Jews and other minority communities living between the river and the sea; on principles of democracy, of one man, one person, one vote; and the fundamental rules of human rights that establish a judicial process, a representation process, a governance process that respects the individual human rights of the people living between the river and the sea. I'll pause there to turn over the mic to Mike to talk about how we came out with the blueprint and what exactly the transitional government that we propose establishment of will seek to accomplish during its 3-year tenure.
Thank you, Sarah Lee, and a special thank you to Professor Aziz and Rutgers and the Center for hosting us for this, to share what we've put so much into producing with the hopes that it can reach ears like yours and policymakers around the world. Um, so what did we do here with this book? First off, we didn't start this project as a book. It started as a policy paper, as an attempt to really demonstrate that it is possible to dismantle the regimes of apartheid and occupation that Sarah Lee discussed as the one state reality earlier, because we do believe that it's that lack of an alternative process to the Oslo two-state process has blinded and robbed policymakers of language to even consider any alternatives. So we started by interviewing nearly 100 stakeholders and experts and scholars, as to the most extent possible, Palestinians and Israelis on the ground, as well as those with subject matter expertise, and a stake and interest and scholarship in this field around the world, and discuss the individual components of what needs to happen to dismantle these regimes of apartheid and occupation. Then we took that sort of basic framework and did comparative research into post-colonial and democratic transitions elsewhere in the world, from South Africa to Northern Ireland to Yugoslavia and Bosnia and many other places, and see what worked, what failed, what's relevant, not because we thought that we would find a one-size-fits-all answer, but because there are lessons to be learned. You know, a lot of this has been tried, and as unique as the Palestine situation and Israeli-Palestinian conflict appears to be at many times, you know, there have been similar situations around the world that have turned out okay, and you know, others that didn't. So we looked to see what worked, what failed, what's relevant, and implemented those and incorporated them into the plan that we ultimately put together. The book was published by the University of California, so it was peer-reviewed by 5 scholars, in addition to going back to many of those original stakeholders and folks that we consulted to really workshop this and make sure that, you know, while some people are sure to be dissatisfied with parts of it, that we had a solid approach that we can stand behind and advocate for. So I'm gonna go to sharing my screen now, because I'm gonna talk a little bit about what the plan actually is. So what is the blueprint? There's 9 steps, and I'm not gonna go through the details of each one, but just to give you a sense of what we envision accomplishing through such a transition. First off, there's a caretaker government, as Sarah Lee mentioned. This is locally led, but with international supervision. But the idea being that the current regime that controls all of the people between the river and the sea cannot be the same one responsible for dismantling the systems of oppression and illegal occupation that it's responsible for creating and maintaining. So that, you know, involves a consociational model with a representation quota for Palestinians and Jews and other minorities in the caretaker government. The adoption of guiding principles that dictate how it must act. This is, you know, in accordance with the principles that Sarah Lee mentioned, but, you know, in far more detail. And actually, you know, the part to emphasize here that isn't clear from the presentation point, from the PowerPoint, is that we are transforming an undemocratic one-state reality into a democratic one, so that the bigger political questions can be addressed. And doing that requires creating what looks and acts as a one-state democratic reality. So that, you know, involves ending military rule and the apartheid laws that that have been created to maintain Jewish supremacy in the Israeli rule over the past 80 some odd years, from revoking emergency laws, extending the existing criminal and many other laws that exist in Israel today, with many, many modifications to the entire territory so that there is equal protection under the law for all people, rescinding the ability of any military to operate domestically, similar to the idealistic notion of that we have in the United States, although that's being challenged at the moment. And a freeze on property transfers, just so that there's no opportunistic coming in and buying up, shock doctrine style capitalist takeover that can undermine a political process like this. We immediately restore freedom of movement for all people in order to ensure that that there is still the possibility to maintain security for both Palestinians and Israelis. We do keep the physical infrastructure of the checkpoints that Israel has implemented over the years in place temporarily, handed over to civilian police, an integrated police force, and with a complete ban on categorical restrictions on movement, meaning you cannot ban Palestinians or Muslims or Jews or anybody else, but you can screen for weapons and other contraband as a means of effective law enforcement while this transition is taking place, because things like integrating security forces and stabilizing a situation like this do take time. We replace the Israeli judiciary, specifically the High Court of Justice, which has been integral to shaping and maintaining the apartheid and occupation rules and giving them a veneer of legality over the years. I won't get into the different ways that we address lower courts, but it's very thought through in how to make sure that supports this process and maintains the rule of law and access to justice for all people in the territory, grant equal citizenship for all people in the territory. As I mentioned, integration of police and security forces and intelligence with robust lustration, meaning the exclusion of those who are responsible or believed to be responsible for grave human rights violations and other grave crimes. A new security doctrine that makes sure that law enforcement is loyal to the new regime and not to their previous ethnic affiliation. A robust disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process, again, locally led, but with lots of international support. And this is, specifically targeting the irregular armed groups operating in the territory, whether they be Israeli settler militias or, groups like the Israeli Border Police, but also the non-official Palestinian groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad and others. This results, as Sarah Lee mentioned, in democratic elections at the end of 3 years, followed by a referendum, which is not mandatory, but and the choices of which we're not prescribing or even saying what they should be necessarily, but the idea being that after we've leveled the political playing field, that the people, the ultimate stakeholders, can decide what sort of political structures or state structures and how many states they want to live under. But with the key difference of the idea of holding a referendum today being that the default, the fallback, if a referendum fails, is a democratic reality and not a reality of oppression and apartheid and occupation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen again. So the missing policy link here is, it's largely the problem that we came to answer, which is the Oslo process and this insistence by the international community that the Oslo process of, there's no solution but the two-state solution. The two-state solution is dead. Long live the two-state solution, has blinded policymakers, as I mentioned earlier, to even considering alternatives. And there are people who have, and groups who are actively putting forth alternative visions for the future. There's the One State Democratic Initiative or campaign made up of Palestinians and Israelis seeking one democratic state. There is a group called Land for All that is advocating for a confederation of sorts based on the framework of a two-state solution. And of course, those still pushing for a two-state solution itself. But almost none of them have an articulated vision of how to get from point A to point B, meaning there are lots of groups also, like the BDS campaign, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign, and many others, pushing for negative consequences for Israel's crimes of ongoing occupation and apartheid, but nothing how to get from point A to point B of, if those sanctions work, what is the off-ramp? So I'm going to pass it back to Sarah Lee for the next stage here. But our plan really seems to bridge those 2 points of, if we are, as a human rights community, as political movements, able to create the pressure that compels Israelis to be willing to change, and we do believe that it's impossible to impose a solution from the outside, at least a just one. That type of pressure, and it doesn't have to come alone. It'll have to be combined with economic realities, and unfortunately, dramatically raising the cost of ongoing occupation and apartheid for Israelis, for them to be willing to consider an alternative. And we saw it, and I believe we succeeded in laying out how to go, where to go from there.
Yeah, I would just add that when Mike and I started working on the blueprint, it was almost an academic exercise, because we didn't imagine that the conversation next for Palestine would be so front and center for policymakers. I think there's now global consensus that the international community does not know what to do, does not know how to fix what's broken. The only plans being put forward are about annexation, further displacement, and if you look at the policies in place, there is forced displacement and genocide. Since we know that those are not viable, acceptable options, we wanted to create a different plan to start a conversation and thinking about a viable alternative. Little did we expect that tens of thousands of Palestinians, I'm sure the number will exceed 100,000 when the rubble is lifted, have paid with their lives to force the international community to reckon with the failure to come up with a plan, to come up with a solution to fix this. Little did we expect that the plan that we put forward would have such immediate to persuade policymakers that there is an alternative vision to the dead Oslo process, and that the blueprint can be the launch pad for those discussions, and the blueprint can be the off-ramp to motivate the international community to increase its pressure on Israel and the Israeli public to relinquish their apartheid and occupation for a better future, to rejoin the international community as a state that is not committing the crimes of this illegal occupation and apartheid. And we hope that it will encourage policymakers that if they do pressure Israel, there is a plan they can latch onto. There is something that they can put forward. We also, with all humility, offer up our blueprint in the hopes that we can stimulate discussion and debate. If our blueprint is defective, if there are things in it that people take issue with, then we want them to come up with a better plan, to come up with an improved plan. As long as we can abandon the corpse of the Oslo process for good, and understand and agree that there is no other plan and that we must come up with a new plan to end this man-made problem. So if we can be the stimulants of new discussion, new plans, new thinking, new urgency, to creating a plan to fill the vacuum that's created by the dead Oslo process, then we hope that that will be a contribution as well. I know we don't have it in our blueprint, but Mike and I were talking based on our experience that we thought we would also take a few minutes to address what we consider to be frequently asked questions. We have a whole chapter in our book dedicated to those frequently asked questions, questions that our interlocutors, people who have worked with us over the past few years to come up with the blueprint, continue to raise in the talks that we've given, in our workshopping of this blueprint to others. We've discovered that there are sort of repeated questions that come up. And so in anticipation of that, I thought we would highlight them. But since I don't have them in front of me, I'll ask Mike to start by teeing one up maybe, and I'll answer one and he'll answer one. So, Mike, do you want to tee up the first one in the chapter?
Sure. I mean, I think we really did get a lot of challenging questions in the process of putting this together. The first, and I'll pose it to you, Sarah Lee, and then maybe we can go to the questions from the audience and see if any of these are left unaddressed, and we can come back to them. Is how do we get to a place where this is relevant?
Yeah, so that is the biggest leap in imagination, because we're urging our readers to imagine the possibility of a different future where the people of Israel, Jewish Israelis first and foremost, but also Palestinians, consent. Um, we imagine that there can come a time when the international pressure is so extreme, is so daunting for the Jewish Israeli citizenship, that they no longer want to be ostracized by the whole world, that they no longer want to be expelled from sporting matches and Eurovision contests, that they don't want to be persona non grata wherever they travel around the world, facing arrest and prosecution for the crimes committed by their soldiers, and seen as the global international community as a criminal apartheid state. When that moment comes, in the face of increasing sanctions, increasing boycotts, increasing moves of divestment, we hope to provide that off ramp. We're not at that moment yet. But there is a new generation of Israelis that may not want the future to look like the current reality that they're living in. And we have seen that sort of voluntary transition take place, for example, in South Africa, where white South Afrikaner government relinquished their power for the establishment of a new government and a new state. And we think that is possible if we provide a blueprint to Jewish Israelis and to Palestinians that assures them of their security, their safety, their stability, that assures them that a transition will not completely upend their lives, if it does upend their privileges, their unjust privileges, with the anticipation and hope for living in a democracy, a normal democracy where people participate and people move and people are not bombed and executed and raped willy-nilly. And so that is the biggest leap, to imagine that anybody will give up power willingly or voluntarily. But it's not really just willing and voluntarily. It is a product of domestic pressure. It is a product of the pressure that emerges in seeing your loved ones, young men and women, dying in war after war after war after war with no end in sight, and the global pressure, the global sanctions, the global isolation. We have already nearly 20 countries, including the number 2 and number 3 weapons suppliers of Israel, who have imposed an embargo on weapons to Israel. We've seen over a dozen countries suspend diplomatic relations with Israel or withdraw their ambassadors or cut all ties. We think that the global momentum in the recognition of the state of Palestine is a very strong indicator and represents a veto of continued Israeli occupation. Again, this is a moment of opportunity, and we hope to contribute to the expansion of that moment of opportunity. So let me throw one back at you, Mike, and Zaha, you can let us know when we should just turn it to the audience. But as we noted, the blueprint focuses on ending the crimes of occupation and apartheid. Those are the principal issues that we focus on. But what about Palestinian refugees? And what about reparations and justice? What does the blueprint have to say about those important topics?
Sorry, Professor Aziz, did you want to go to the audience?
No, go ahead, answer that, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah, so because we defined a limited scope for what we're trying to accomplish with this plan, because a solution, despite the pressure and the vision that can be provided from the outside, needs to come from the people who are going to live under whatever future comes after this really abhorrent and far too long regime of occupation and apartheid and now genocide. And one of the things that we felt fell outside of that, out of that mandate, was questions of transitional justice in the broadest sense, which is to say that they cannot be ignored. These are not things that you can pretend away, that you can just grant equal rights to everybody and that's the end of things. But it is to say that these are questions that will need to be answered by the people who have to live with the consequences of them and the compromises of them. So there's a few main areas where that comes into play. I'll first mention a few places where we do address matters of transitional justice. One of them is to immediately remove movable property. There was a brilliant documentary by Al Jazeera about a decade ago, I believe it was called The Great Book Robbery, about how Israel has seized, a really just, a treasure trove of private libraries from Palestinians, and they're holding on to it today, marked as absentee property, knowing who they belong to. Return the books, right? When there's land that is not currently being occupied by Israelis or others, return the land, right? However, there are three major questions that we sort of we didn't punt on them, but really recognize that they have to be answered in a post-transition period. However, we did put great effort and thought into laying the groundwork for making sure that that can happen. So those three areas are refugees, Palestinian refugees to be specific, land restitution. There were nearly 1,000 Palestinian villages that were depopulated in 1948 and even more in 1967 and even more in the last 2 years, both in the Gaza Strip and West Bank. And there needs to be a transitional justice process that deals with that. And the third is accountability. So with regards to refugees, we do take steps to immediately recognize the rights of Palestinian refugees, to create a process for resettlement, for repatriation of those who face immediate threats to their lives, and for family reunification of first-degree relatives, with an understanding that the broader question of how to resolve the Palestinian refugee question will look different depending on what the political outcome of a transition is. Meaning, necessary components, and to make sure that those policy options are ready while providing immediate support to Palestinian refugees, similar to the way that Israel provided support to Jews in the former Soviet Union and many other ways that nation states relate to their diasporas. With regards to accountability, you know, this is a difficult one, especially after the past 2 years. But I think we do need to learn from the South African model that these are things that need to be negotiated in order to be part of a political process. And you know, while the ICC and others should absolutely continue to seek accountability for the gravest crimes that have been committed, including universal jurisdiction in countries across the world, you know, the broader questions of accountability need to fit into a program that allows people to move on as well. And these are not new questions that we're addressing here, but ones that really, you know, we relied heavily on the scholarship and the experts that have looked at these questions from other contexts. Professor Aziz, back to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. I know this is not enough time to cover the wealth of information that you provided in analysis, but I want to make sure that we have a little time to answer some questions from the audience. And I'll pose one of my own, which is, I know, top of mind for all of us, which is the environment in the United States. I mean, we all know that the United States plays an outsized role in influencing what happens in Palestine and Israel, as far back, arguably, at least as 1967, maybe even before. But what's the role of the United States government today, or what do you envision it to be? And how do we overcome what appears to be a monopoly so far domestically over U.S. foreign policy in Israel-Palestine, and it's bipartisan, right? Whether it's the Democrats, whether it's Republicans, maybe it's a little difference in degree and rhetoric, but I don't think substantively it's that different. And related to that is the way in which the mechanisms for making this issue ripe, because you use the word ripeness in the beginning of your book, for the Israeli government and Israeli citizens who are Jewish to actually want to come to the negotiating table, right? To actually want to consider a different future, which is these accountability measures, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, prosecutions of individuals, whether they're elected officials or soldiers, for violations of international law, international human rights law, and so on and so forth. All of these accountability measures are considered almost criminal in the US, if not at least anti-Semitic. And people are losing their jobs. Some of them are subjected to government surveillance and investigation. Universities are cracking down. It's become a problem for American democracy to even support or act on these nonviolent means of accountability to the state of Israel vis-a-vis its genocide, its apartheid, and many other human rights violations. So how do you address that significant impediment?
I would agree with you that the single greatest impediment to freedom and justice in Palestine is the U.S. government right now, and I think it's really incontrovertible that Israel could not be maintaining its occupation, carrying out its wars of destruction without U.S. military and political support. So that is a current fact. But there are two things. First of all, the international community has dramatically shifted and been willing to exercise its voice of opposition to U.S. policies and U.S. support for Israel. And I think part of the shift that you've seen in the Trump administration is a reflection of that. Just as the United States was the last country standing to support apartheid South Africa, I don't doubt that the United States will be the last country standing to support apartheid Israel. But the United States, as much as a hegemon as it is facing dramatic global opposition. Second of all, I would add that domestically the politics is changing, and the unquestioned support for Israel that both Democratic and Republican parties have been extremely loyal to, the one true issue that unites Republicans and Democrats for decades. Their own voters are opposing this and beginning to oppose this, and I think you've seen that reflected in the election of Mayor Mamdani in New York City, which was as much a referendum about Israel-Palestine as it was about domestic New York City issues. I think you see it in a remarkable number of political candidates who are now running for office advertising their refusal to take funding from AIPAC. Advertising their refusal to support weapons for Israel, whereas there was a time that these would be kisses of death, and nobody would dare advertise these things even if they believed them. There is a shift. There's a generational shift. There's a massive shift within the Democratic Party, with over 70% of Democratic Party voters opposing continued weapons to Israel. So I think that between the international pressure and the domestic pressure, it really is becoming a contest for American democracy as well. We now have the US government supporting positions on Israel-Palestine that Americans do not want and Americans do not support. And so the question for our government is, are they going to continue to allow America's policy on Israel to be controlled by a handful of very wealthy pro-Israel donors, or are they going to actually function as a democracy? I mean, foreign policy has always been the least democratic pillar of the American government and the operation of the American government, but we're seeing that change. Our vision obviously relies on an optimistic and hopeful future where good things happen. But as I think, I personally believe in the election that we saw in New York City yesterday and across our country, in a number of Democratic governors being elected, change can come and good things can happen. And there's no reason why good things can't happen in Israel-Palestine if we exercise the collective political will to seek them out and demand them and push for them.
Thank you. So I have another question, and again, Michael, if you want to start, and Sarah, if you want to add, is kind of a similar approach, but to what's happening in Israel, among especially its 80% Jewish population, the Israeli Jews. There are some concerns or some questions, I should say, that the Israeli Jewish population is in complete denial, or that it is kind of buckling down on the iron wall approach of Jabotinsky and actually becoming even less willing to compromise after October 7th, notwithstanding, the horrors that we've witnessed on social media and by brave Palestinian journalists in Gaza who have reported on the genocide because Israel would not allow international journalists inside Gaza, and then only to be assassinated by Israel when they were doing that reporting. So on the one hand, what Sarah Lee Whitson just explained is in many ways the shift. It's not exclusively as a result of this journalistic courage and coverage, but it certainly played a significant role to expose Israel, right, for what it actually does to the Palestinians. But then you hear that in kind of within the boundaries of Israel, that's not the case among the Jewish Israelis. Can you give us a sense of, do you have an idea of what the polling is, or what is there an appetite for this right now in Israel, or is this going to have to be pressured exclusively from the outside?
I don't have recent polling, but I do agree that we are not anywhere close to ripeness when it comes to Jewish Israeli society. This is a society that has gotten fully behind the genocide carried out in Gaza over the past 2 years, carried out by their children, and with their both active and passive support. That ripeness can come about in several different ways. One of them is international pressure, but it's not the only one, and no one factor can take place on its own. or can succeed on its own. But their change is possible, and I do believe, and I say this as somebody who's lived in Israel for many years, that people will wake up eventually, and that is not to say that it makes it okay what happened. But I think that as the stories and images and testimonies of not only the survivors and victims of this genocide come out, but also by the perpetrators, that there will be a shift. I don't think that'll be adequate. And I'm just going to add to a few different ways that change and ripeness can come about. The Israeli economy is very reliant on the tech sector, on the military export sector, and those things can dramatically shift. And the projects of occupation and apartheid and genocide are very expensive. For instance, if international pressure grows and Israeli tech companies move their operations to Belgium or Ireland or the United States, and new entrepreneurs start those companies outside of the country, that will deprive the Israeli state budget of a massive portion of its income. Another angle is that before October 7th, there were already massive cleavages within Israeli society, largely between secular and religious Israelis, but also those sort of ideologically committed to the expansionist and really just ruthlessly supremacist vision of a greater Israel, who would advocate for the expulsion of all Palestinians, as opposed to the others who really believed that they were living in a democratic state. And to their credit, white South Africans lived in a democratic state in their experience as well. But these things can change, and those cleavages are not going away. And the fact that Israel is controlled by messianic settlers whose vision is to expel Palestinians, and even at the expense of international isolation, is going to continue to drive wedges in Israeli society. And people, generally speaking, want a future. And if they don't see it, whether it's because of intractable violence that they don't see a way out of, or because they can't make a living, or because they feel oppressed in their own country, and if the messianic settlers and ultra-Orthodox take over, or vice versa, one of those two groups will feel oppressed as well, albeit nowhere near the experience of Palestinians. And all of those things together, combined with other factors that maybe we can't predict at this moment, can lead to the type of change that would bring Jewish Israelis, or at least a Jewish Israeli leadership, with the legitimacy to start considering different paths forward, to start considering a way of existing without that supremacy that defines the political manifestations of Zionism that are Israel today.
Thank you. Sarah, did you want to add anything? Okay, so there are questions about what to do next. What is the role? I mean, we are in an American university. Most of the audience are Americans. And given what you've proposed, both in the book and also through your conversation or your discussion, how can academics, organizers, policy analysts, and movement lawyers harness kind of the momentum that we've seen, especially around the Palestine solidarity movement? And I just want to note, the students have paid a very heavy price. Right? The Palestinian, the Muslim, the Arab, the anti-Zionist Jewish students, the Black, Latino, white students. I mean, the students who participated in the encampments and the nonviolent encampments, the nonviolent protests that really harken us back to the anti-Vietnam protest movement and even the 1967, 1968 student movement, have paid a very heavy price, right? In a country that claims to value and protect free speech and political activism. But nevertheless, they have successfully, along with allies, kind of fueled and created this Palestine solidarity movement. What would you recommend for the various stakeholders? How can Americans be part of this solution, whether it's specifically through this blueprint you propose or something similar?
first of all, again, expressing gratitude to the students and the academics who led the protest movement against U.S. support for the genocide in Gaza. I think that was a critically important factor in educating Americans, bringing the issue of Palestine to the fore in our own cities and towns. And I understand that severe punishments that have been imposed across the board in light of that. But I really do see the global repression campaign that Israel and its supporters in the United States are pursuing is an act of desperation because they have lost the argument. They have lost the power to persuade people or woo people with their hasbara. And now they're trying to force people to think a certain way. And I don't really think that ever works. I don't really think you will succeed in forcing people to reject their own opinions, their own values. It's kind of the last gasp of a dying cause, the dying cause of Zionism that is predicated on the suppression and oppression of another people. What I would to urge people to do is to continue to organize, continue to prioritize the question of U.S. policy in your voting, continue to seek office and run for office. And I hope that Mamdani is a role model for the many young people in the audience right now, that there are school boards that need to be filled. There are local city councils that need to be populated. And every one of you has an equal right and chance and need to participate in that process, not only as voters, but as candidates. So please consider running for office. Please consider participating and prioritizing the question of our own government's complicity in war crimes and crimes against humanity. This does not need to be what our country continues to do. And I hope that we can see a shift and a change. But most importantly, the power of the election booth is the number one power that we still have, as evidenced in New York City, despite the hundreds of millions of dollars that were spent to defeat Mamdani. The voters rejected that. They rejected that interference. And we know the vast majority of that money came from people who were specifically opposed to Mayor Mamdani's position on Palestine. So again, this is a referendum on that issue, and the people have won, and the people can win across the board.
Thank you. Mike, did you have any closing remarks you wanted to make?
I think it's along the same lines of what Sarah Lee was just saying, which is that we have to hold our politicians accountable, and that means not necessarily even only on one issue. There are so many domestic issues in the United States that are just as important, if not more important, for regular Americans. But the way to ensure that we have a politics and a political system that respects those is to demand moral consistency from our politicians and from our leaders and from our institutions. And that has not been the case when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to Israel over the past 70 years and more. And we have to hold them responsible for that. And that means punishing them electorally and financially, and to insist on the truths that I think we all understand, that this is an unacceptable situation that has to stop, and that the United States is the only country in the world, and really the leader of the United States is the only person in the world that has the power to change that.
Thank you.
I'll just add that the book is available on Amazon and Bookshop and everywhere else you get your books, From Apartheid to Democracy.
I was just about to show it. I highly recommend this book. It is, when you first start reading it, you are correct, both of you. There is this sense of this is completely unrealistic, but the more you dig into it, the more you think it is possible. And I think this is what knowledge production does, is it helps to envision the possible, which may in the future then actually become the reality. So I do hope that everyone reads the book, From Apartheid to Democracy, A Blueprint for Peace in Israel-Palestine. And I'll also put a plug in for a few of the products that the Center for Security, Race, and Rights has published. The first is Threats to Free Speech and Palestine Civil Rights, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. That has been the primary legal tool that's been used to try to codify the censorship against criticism of Israel and criticism of its military's international human rights violations by attempting to conflate Zionism with Judaism and conflate the state of Israel with Judaism and Jews. And it's completely in bad faith because the objective, again, is to try to stop what Ms. Whitson and Mr. Omer-Man just discussed today and what their book talks about, which is this movement to hold Israel more accountable and ideally create a one-state solution that has or a democratic state that has different configurations, different possible configurations. And then finally, I'll also encourage you all to read Presumptively Anti-Semitic, Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, which, even though it was published in 2023 of the fall, I think it helps to explain why Mamdani was under such attack as a Muslim in the way that Islamophobic tropes were used. And then finally, if you found this presentation informative, if you find our past lectures informative, which I encourage you to watch or listen to by subscribing to CSRR's YouTube channel, please make a donation. Go to csrr.rutgers.edu, press the donate button, and please give generously. And with that, we thank you to Sarah Lee Whitson, to Michael Omer-Man, and we thank our audience, and we look forward to seeing you at the next lecture in the spring of 2026. مع السلامة.